Okay, we're live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. This week's topic is global basic income. So what would it take to implement basic income at the global level? And there's a lot of complexity there, including what kinds of institutions do you have to have in place, and what kind of institutions you have to have in place, and what money are we giving out? Is it dollars? Is it something else? Like everybody uses different currencies in their different countries. What does it mean to have a global basic income? Is it the same for everyone? Is it the same currency for everyone? All of that. There's lots of interesting questions here. And this topic is, near and dear to my heart because 5 years ago, I actually designed a global basic income system called the Gresham system. Austin is here tonight, and he has also designed a global basic income system that works differently from the one I designed. So I'm sure we'll have a lot of thoughts coming from people who have been thinking about this a lot. And some of us read an article from FT Alphaville called "Money Hierarchy: The Global Perspective," and that is by Izabella Kaminska. So she talks about a lot of the kind of the global monetary system. So in order to have a basic income, you have to be able to give people money. So there's going to be a monetary system there. So this article basically looks at kind of the structure of that, and we ourselves can think about how basic income fits into that picture. So I'll start by going around and getting people's initial thoughts on global basic income, basically anything like, is it a good idea? Should basic income even be at the global level? Does it make more sense to do it at the level of individual countries? What's the right level to do it at? Does it make sense to have a global basic income if you don't have a global government? All of these types of questions. So any thoughts about global basic income? So we'll go in the order, Derek, Austin, and then Bethany to start.
I think this is a really interesting topic. I'm looking forward to hearing the thoughts from people that have studied it more in depth than I have. I'm in favor of basic income, and I kind of think that as a general rule, the more producers that are in a network, your basic income network, the better off the consumers in that network are going to be. So if you have one state doing a basic income, that's pretty cool. If you have 2 or 3 doing it, that's even better. So I can't really see any reason why that wouldn't keep scaling up. There are, I think, probably unique challenges that come with the conceiving as intentionally wanting to create a global basic income, like starting from that position. And there may be challenges of how you go from a national one to a global one. But theoretically, on the face of it, I don't see any reason why this sort of power law of the more people you have in the network and the more production going on in the network, the better potential anyway there is for like the higher basic income you get, the more benefit you could get out of it. So I'm pretty sure something like global basic income will eventually be in our future.
Okay, great. Let's go Austin, then Bethany, then Eddie.
Hey guys, I think a global basic income is definitely the best kind of basic income. And I think it avoids some of the problems you might have introducing national basic incomes, especially if they are introduced in rich, powerful, or large countries first. So if you imagine the EU or United States or the sort of first world countries introduced to UBI, then you actually sort of increase international inequality, and you worsen some of the issues we face now, where you have with sort of cross-border wage competition. So you have richer and richer Westerners which creates pressures on wages in the West up. Meanwhile, wages are still very low in the developing world. And then you get a sort of increase of the offshoring, domestic and sort of migrant worker phenomenons, where you've got different kinds of cross-border wage competition. Could get a lot worse if you have a poor country introduce a basic income first, like India or somewhere like that. That's a slightly different scenario and maybe less problematic. But I think a global basic income would be ideal. And what I imagine is, in the end, that you have a global basic income issued by global institutions, and then you have that layered on top of that. You have national basic income. So the global one would be enough to cover the cost of living in the developing world, in Africa and India and Asia. Not all of Asia, but the poorer parts of Asia. Whereas then the national ones would top it up to the level of the country. And that way you have a sort of a true floor under which nobody can fall. And I mean, it's not super simple because you've got to make sure that the national ones are sort of set at the right level, because actually I think you want to sort of depressurize migration, so that there's not this huge incentive for people to migrate to the first world and this punishment for those who don't. And yeah, that's my basic idea. I'm really big on it. I've posted an article about how I think it could work in the chat.
Okay, fantastic. Let's go to Bethany, Eddie, and then Elizabeth.
Yeah, I like a lot of what Derek and Austin both said. So some initial thoughts similar to Derek. There are probably a lot of complications that I haven't thought through politically and in terms of managing whatever the currency is and things like that. But there also seem to be some big efficiency gains, both avoiding perverse incentives, in terms of migration and wages, like Austin said, but also, and of course, reaching quality of life for more people. Also using people's time and resources efficiently. So, right now, there are people who, spend a lot of their day just walking to get water and back. And if that's a chosen lifestyle, that's fine. But for a lot of people, it's not. And to kind of hook them into the broader economy where things can be produced so efficiently in other places and not have to have people's day-to-day time in other places go towards things that have been kind of that could be easily provided for them if they had the money to do so, to kind of be more integrated into the global economy, I think would be a big welfare gain for a lot of people. And also an efficiency gain, like Derek was saying, for the whole system, where those people could spend their time on something else, which might be happy for them or possibly very like productive for people elsewhere in the world as well. So it seems like as a long-term goal, at least, there's just a lot more gains for everyone by sort of integrating people, as Derek was saying, into the same economic system. So yeah.
Yeah, Eddie, Elizabeth, and then Matt.
So I think that a global basic income would be kind of the ideal, but I suspect that if it's difficult to get a basic income in the US, it will be even more difficult to manage to get it across the entire globe, where you have to have all different countries agreeing to the framework. A lot of problems are impossible to start locally. For example, climate change is not a problem that you can solve locally. It has to be a global solution. And that is kind of being held up a great deal by global politics. But basic income is actually something that can be solved locally. So, someone mentioned something in an earlier discussion, which I really loved, which is, we have these trade conflicts in the world right now, and some of them center around anti-dumping. And so the conflict that we're having is, the different countries are saying to each other, oh, you're trying to sell your stuff to us too cheap. and the other country is saying, no, you're trying to sell something else to us too cheap. Which is really kind of funny. And it relates to the situation that the entire globe is in. Which is, a lot of economists talk about a savings glut in the world, that there's like too much savings in the world, which is a very interesting thing. Take me a couple of years thinking about it, but if you think about what, how much savings is too much savings, and if you think about it, the only way that savings can be too much savings, because if you're talking about at any level, theoretically, when you save stuff, when you have a lot of savings, you can invest the savings, and at any level, you can use that to build capital to improve for the future. But the only reason you would ever have a savings glut, or seem to have a savings glut, is in the context that consumers don't have enough money to spend. And so capital investment cannot occur because it would not be profitable because people don't have money to buy the production. That's your savings glut when you don't have enough investment, so you have lots of savings, not enough investment of the savings, and so the savings kind of float around and drive the returns very far down. So to solve this problem at any level, I'd say even at a city level, you can actually distribute your currency to provide the consumption that the entire world is lacking, and you can actually take advantage of the way that this current system generates too much excess capital, and you can actually absorb that into your currency at your level and use it to encourage people to invest into your area, because people in your area have a great deal of purchasing power. So any businesses that come, you're going to be very full up, which you're not anywhere else, because people have money to spend, and you'd be able to raise interest rates in your area simply because you're allowing people to have money to spend, which makes investment profitable in your area when it's not in the world, even though it should be.
Yeah, I think those are some really good points. I think when people imagine a savings glut, they're imagining that because someone is saving money, it's preventing the consumers from having money. But if you have a basic income, then the savings can go towards investment, and the basic income can go towards activating that capital, activating that productive capacity.
Absolutely. I mean, there's two loops. One, in that you're directly not demanding stuff, and then two, in that because people are not demanding stuff, the savings doesn't have a place to go. It can't get invested. Yeah.
Right. Yep. Let's go to Elizabeth, Matt, and then Richard.
I definitely feels like a global basic income feels ideal for a lot of reasons that people have mentioned. I struggle with figuring out like how you would kind of figure out like how you level that. Like I know you talk a lot about, we match it with the productive capacity of the economy, but like not everyone in a global economy has access to all of that productive capacity. Like it's one thing to say like, okay, like everyone in the US sort of has roughly the same access to stuff, but thinking about sort of wide range from like Bethany's point of, folks who are living in really like rural villages, through to folks, who are like, middle class in the US with a lot of like technological access. Like, how do you figure out that level? And like, I'm sure it's a soluble problem, but when I think about trying to do a global basic income, it feels like, okay, how, like, do you average that out across the global economy? Like, are you building in ways for people to access? Yeah, I have a lot of questions about how that would work.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And this kind of calls back to, I don't know if you were here for the discussion of Dutch disease, but we're talking about how some goods are tradable on the international markets, and then some goods are just local goods that you can only really get locally. You can't like buy a haircut from China or something like that. So that's an interesting question, because even if you give everyone the same nominal basic income in the same currency, it's not going to buy the same stuff depending on where you are. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Let's go to Matt, Richard, and then Steve.
Yeah, so, I mean, the first question that pops up is like, should we give people a global basic income? And I think the arguments for that are the same as, a local one. And I think, we all are more or less in agreement with those to at least some extent. So it's probably more apt to focus on some of the additional questions. So the first that comes to mind is, what are we distributing? Is it US dollars? Is it local currency? Is it some new global currency? Do people have an option? Or is it, a cryptocurrency? I've seen some proposals for that are pretty interesting. Then it's, how are you going to distribute it? One option is you do it electronically. I think, is it 2 billion people now have cell phones, maybe more? So that number keeps going up. So that's one option, but that's not going to reach everyone. So probably some aspect of it has to be physical, but then you need a whole network to actually get those, tokens to people. So that's a whole infrastructure. Who's going to do it? Is it some global government, some one organization? Is it coordinated by all the different national governments? Yeah, and so I guess I'll talk briefly about, I just wanted to bring up crypto. I tend not to talk about it because you can sometimes sound like a crank, I guess, if you talk about crypto all the time. But I do think that this is a scenario in which it makes sense. But it would have to be a different, I don't know what, there's a word that I'm looking for, but a different kind, I guess. Whereas a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, it's supposed to be valuable because the amount of Bitcoins is capped. There's a limit to it. Whereas, your global basic income currency is going to have to, regularly increase. Like each person gets a new token every day or every week or every month or something. And so it really changes the way we think about currency because it's no longer valuable because it's scarce. Because it's by definition, it's not scarce. And so I think that opens just some bigger questions about like, how does that work and how do we get people to value that and want that? I don't have the answers, but I think it's something to think about.
Yeah, a lot of interesting thoughts there. I'm sure we'll get into some of the cryptocurrency stuff. Let's go to Richard and then Steve.
The only way I think that we'll ever have some sort of like basic income in a timely manner is that there's going to be has to be some sort of global crisis, like an asteroid's coming or something like that. And well, then they'll might go into something like credits or Latinum or something, and otherwise we'll might eventually like go into like political economic blocks like in 00 Gundam, where they have the American Union, which includes like North and South America with its center of gravity in like the US and Canada, and like Europe and Africa and or something, things like that.
Okay, so you're saying that some pretty out there stuff is going to have to happen in our society in order for us to have a global basic income. That's interesting. Let's go to Steve.
I'll have a footnote for Richard. Latinum in Star Trek: The Next Generation, as Richard knows, is the currency of the Ferengi because it's the only thing, the only material in the universe that can't be made in the replicator. So it is actually scarce, even in the post-scarcity science fiction. So you see, it's actually reasonable. They've thought it through. But what I was going to say is the first thing that comes to mind about global basic income is that a lot of the world is living on $1 a day. So if their monthly basic income was $30 a month, it would be life altering for the millions and billions. And if the rich countries were to pay the basic income, it would be a small amount of money for the rich countries and a huge amount of money for the $1 a day poor. And I guess this is actually happening with Give Directly, is a charity organization and has rich countries give cash to the poor.
Cool. Yeah, that's an interesting point, and it kind of relates to Elizabeth's point about people having different access to different things in different places. If there's the same basic income for everyone, that's going to have a much bigger impact on poorer people and poorer countries than if it's then I guess if you're kind of adjusting it for each country or something like that. If it's the same for everyone, it's going to vastly help poor people more. And this kind of speaks to Austin's point too, which is that if you're if you're giving a basic income at the level of one country, that can maybe upset the international balance or international inequality. So if America pays out a basic income only to its citizens, then that also means that everyone else isn't getting a basic income, that kind of thing.
But also, like Elizabeth said, that if you just gave everybody in the world $1,000 a month, this wouldn't actually help the dollar-a-day poor. It would just wildly inflate their prices because they don't have the supply sector, that they don't have the Walmart to deliver all the stuff. So it would take some time for the supply sector to catch up.
Yeah, that's a really good point too. So you might be able to order, and the article gets into this a little bit, you might be able to order a bunch of stuff on Amazon, but how much do you really want to buy American goods with your dollars? Yeah. So lots of interesting points. My initial thoughts on this is that we have a global economy and we have people, everyone is a person, everyone in the world is a person. And just as we would want the national economy to serve the citizens of our country, why shouldn't we want the global economy to serve all the people in the world, kind of to the greatest extent possible? So global basic income does feel like this this ideal that yeah, I mean, basic income at the national level is great, but if you had it worldwide, that seems better. And like unless you want to be treating people differently and care about people differently or something like that. And there are these differences, like giving everyone the same amount of money isn't gonna make everyone's situation the same right away. But it does kind of break down some of the barriers. It allows more people to have more. So even if you don't have Walmarts in a poor country or something like that, it creates an opportunity to build out that stuff. It just might be a little bit of a bumpy transition as you kind of move towards that. So maybe I think there's always a case to be made for rolling anything out gradually. But yeah, it would be potentially a bad thing if you gave everyone $1,000 a month and then all of the poorer countries stopped making their own food and started ordering all their own food on Amazon. And then, the politics shifted or something changed and you didn't have the basic income anymore. And now you leave everyone worse off than when they started because they can't make their own food anymore, that kind of thing. I'm thinking of the analogy of, when we went in and gave everyone all these poor people baby formula in Africa, and then they couldn't afford to buy the rest of it, and then they couldn't breastfeed either because they'd been using baby formula for so long, that kind of thing. So you definitely want to be careful. It's great to provide things for people. It's not great to make people dependent on you and then take away the support or risk having that support go away. Yeah, Austin, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember as well how dysfunctional the current system is as well. Like 9 million people starve to death every year. And that was before the current crash, right? Like the level of, so when we're talking about the risks of introducing it, you've got to balance that against, the harm that the status quo is doing. It's easy for people to have a sort of a fear of loss, right? As a human irrationality that's been documented, that you're worried that the new thing people are very risk averse when it's something new. And I think we tend to maybe potentially overestimate the risks relative to the risk of doing nothing. And we're also in a situation right now where the global economy is going through a rapid contraction. So I think the asteroid's coming, guys. I think we're in a crisis. And this is what I say in my article. It's like, this could actually be the crisis that forces the global institutions that we do have to take some kind of drastic action, because it's, the economic fallout from what's happening is going to roll on, and it's making a bad problem worse in terms of, global poverty and hunger. And I think a lot of the times the supply chains do reach people, they reach at least the cities that they're in or the regions that they're in. There's that last mile to the village problem in some cases, but I really think the big problem is that people don't have any money in a lot of these cases. And even the head of the World Food Program I was reading recently said, look, if there's commercial supply chains are the only way to really feed people. we don't want that if they go in with humanitarian food distribution, that only works in places where a commercial supply chain could work anyhow. You know, if the infrastructure is not there for commercial food distribution, then it's not there for humanitarian food distribution. So I'm very bullish on a world basic income, and I think that you know, that it's more possible than it might seem, and that we have some of sort of the proto institutions for it already.
Okay, yeah, those are some interesting thoughts. And I know in your article, you write about the IMF being one of those proto institutions. Is that right?
Yeah, and SDRs. Yes, exactly. So they already issue this thing called special drawing rights to nations, which is kind of like a weird version of a treasury bond. So it's an asset-bearing, it's an interest-bearing asset that you can trade for 5 different global currencies: the yen, the Chinese ren, I never say it right, the Chinese currency, the US dollar and the euro, and the pound sterling, right? So that they issue that now, and that's something that we could anchor a new global currency or a global basic income to, so that you make it that the governments can then, you know, collect this up as taxes and buy special drawing rights from the IMF with a new global currency, and that's how you would anchor the new currency in the existing global institutions. And in 2008 or 2009, following the crisis, they already did a mass allocation of these, right? So they had they had about 20 billion in circulation, and then they pumped that up to 200 billion in circulation, and these assets held their value. You know, there's enough faith in the global institutions that they existed. So they're like treasury bonds, but they just sort of give them to governments, and really only governments can hold them. But they are exchangeable between governments for currency, and they accrue interest, and you can pay your IMF debts with them. So there's, in the hierarchy of money, like in the article, that's the paper gold that could provide the convertibility to underpin a global currency.
Right. So yeah, for people who aren't familiar with special drawing rights, in 1968, the IMF introduced these things because the world was kind of running out of gold reserves. So they introduced this thing called a special drawing right. Initially, they had other names for it, but people were like, no, it's not a currency. We don't want to call it a reserve, and you know, like there's all this politics and stuff. They ended up calling it special drawing rights, and it was worth equivalent, or it was designed to be worth equivalent to a certain amount of gold. But the idea was that the world monetary system would kind of stay the same as it was in 1968, which is that it was technically a gold-backed system. Now the United States had most of the world's gold, so the dollar was pegged to gold at the time. But only a few years later, in 1971, Nixon took us off the gold standard, the international gold standard. So then the IMF had to kind of redo what the special drawing rights were, and it ended up being, instead of representing a certain amount of gold, it represented a certain amount of different world currencies. And there have always been a lot of people, there have been times when people have been excited about you know, making it the world's reserve currency instead of the dollar, because, and especially China has been talking about this in the last decade. They really want the SDR to be, you know, because it's kind of this weighted, you know, fairer representation of, you know, kind of like the average currency values of the major currencies, that kind of thing. They want that to be the world reserve currency. Unfortunately, you can't just, you can't even legislate that you want something to be true and make it true that way. It has to be compatible with the global economic system. So the reality is that nobody uses the SDRs as currency. As Austin was saying, only governments can hold it, which on the face of it, that seems fine, right? Like we have bank reserves that only banks can hold, and you know, you and I don't have access. We can't have accounts at the Fed with our bank reserves, but nonetheless, that is kind of like the underpinning reserve of our domestic monetary system. So the question is, how do you get something like SDRs to be the world reserve currency? And there really isn't as much of a promise there as you might think. So when you go to the bank and you withdraw your deposits, you get a bunch of cash, and that's a promise that's being made. You can get the cash out. There's no kind of corresponding promise with SDRs. There's no promise that you can redeem your SDRs for the underlying currencies. Now, sometimes countries will do that for you, but they're not required to. The requirements that exist with the IMF is that when you sign up to be a member of the IMF, you have to commit a certain amount of your currency towards backing the special drawing rights. So there's currency that's put in, that's paid into the IMF, but the IMF isn't required to pay it back out, and the individual countries aren't required to pay out currency for the SDRs, that kind of thing. And all of that is political, right? Like you could have had something that required countries to honor the SDR, or required the IMF to kind of honor the backing of the SDR. But how do you get them to do that? You have to get the countries to agree. So this is related to someone's question earlier, which is to have a global basic income, or to even have a global currency, do you have to somehow get all the countries to come together and agree with each other, or not? And I think if you're trying to go the SDR route, that's more the route of somehow you have to get everyone to kind of agree with each other. Let's go to Matt.
Yeah, it seems like Austin wants to respond to that, so I'm happy to let him take
Yeah,
a
sure.
crack
Let's
at
go to
that.
Austin.
I'll keep it brief. The one thing that you can do with SDRs, which is very important for third world countries, is pay back IMF debts. So if these countries are getting cash loans from the IMF, and then they can repay them with SDRs, which I believe then go out of circulation when the IMF receives them back as. So that's a very real benefit for governments in the poor world. It won't be as attractive to, the US, which doesn't take IMF loans. But if you're, Indonesia or Ecuador, or the places where people need this currency most, your government, if you have a token that's redeemable for SDRs, that's going to be attractive to your government, because they can then buy the IMF has to make SDRs available and then accept them back and continue to accept them back as debt repayments. And these debt repayments are a big issue in the third world. So some, relief on that front is a huge liquidity gain for those governments. So I think that would be, in the current system, the sort of the strongest guarantee of their value.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a good point. Let's go to Matt.
Okay, yes, this isn't exactly what I want to say, but I wanted to clarify with Austin. So it seems like he's suggesting that we could do a global basic income with giving out like some sort of fraction of like an SDR to people as the currency, and that would incentivize the governments of developing countries to tax them because they want them in order to pay back loans to the IMF. And so that would establish demand for that currency, sort of like, the MMT argument that taxes drive currency for like a sovereign currency issuer, except it would be like 2 layers of that, I guess.
Yeah, I propose a sort of a 3-cornered thing. So what I call it in the article is the People's Bancor. So Keynes proposed this currency called the Bancor at Bretton Woods, which was, the good system. Instead, we got the American system. So the idea is that they issued this currency. Then what I actually suggest is that the IMF would then say, well, we're going to auction off SDRs, because then that would create some kind of uncertainty about and competition between nations. So who can get the most of these people's bancors back from their people, to then buy them at these auctions. And because there's some uncertainty as well, you'd want to make sure you have enough, because you don't miss out on what's a good way of lowering your national your debts. And these other debts are in foreign currency that you can't issue. So you issue your own currency, buy the global currency, then use that global currency that you've got off your population to buy SDRs.
Okay, so if people are curious to know more about Austin's plan, which we might talk about a little bit more, definitely check out his article that he shared. So I mean, I think more generally speaking, we can ask the question of what's necessary to be able to have a global currency that you could use to pay out global basic income. One answer to that question is that, you know, rather than trying to do something complicated and new, you know, with the IMF and SDRs, could a country like the United States just unilaterally decide to pay out a basic income to everyone in the world in dollars? And my sense is that we probably could. And then you don't really have to kind of create these new monetary structures. You can use the existing monetary system because the dollar is already kind of like the world currency. It's what's behind all of the other currencies. Let's go to Eddie.
So I also think that the U.S. could actually issue you know, global basic income in the U.S. dollar to other countries, and it would be a very smart thing to do. You know, currently we're, you know, dealing with unemployment with the crisis right now, and you know, unemployment is actually easily solvable by basic income. You know, if you give people money to spend, they go and spend it. That activates the economy and it puts people to work. So I think that would be, you know, kind of a very, you know, politically tenable way to do it. If you're arguing, oh, you know, we have so much underemployment, let's get our people employed, and we can do it by sending out a basic income. Obviously, you'd probably want to send. It'd probably be easier to send more to you know, the U.S. and a little bit and less to everybody else. But I think that would be a smart way to do it, and it would be very, very smart also because what you're doing by sending U.S. dollars to other countries is you're actually using other countries' demand to build up the productive capacity within your own country, which is, you know, advantageous, you know, to your own country. No matter what, it's a good thing that your country is capable of producing things in its economy. I'd argue that China actually does a little bit of this with the management of its currency in keeping its own currency kind of cheaper on the foreign exchange rates, and you know, by buying U.S. dollars on the market and saving up U.S. dollars in its foreign exchange reserves.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting point about unemployment, and basic income solves unemployment from both ends, right? It gives people money, so there aren't as many people who want to be employed. So if you don't care about having a job, you're not unemployed anymore. And then on the other end of things, it creates more demand for labor as well. So it's kind of coming at it from both ends. Yeah. Let's go to Bethany.
Yeah, so on the same topic, I'm wondering what people think about, you know, if one country like the United States is funding the basic income, does that give them a certain amount of political power? Or as you mentioned before, like, are people too concerned that they're dependent on one country, one government? Is the government going to use that as leverage politically, or just the instability of one country's administration changing or things like that? So like, in terms of the currency and the economics, I can see it being sort of a simpler solution than trying to have a world currency, but I wonder about some of these other concerns politically that might come up with that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. One possible solution to that is just that if the United States starts paying out a basic income and starts gaining political advantage because of that, other countries can take a look at that and say, well, wait a minute, maybe we should be paying out a global basic income too. So then you might even end up with a situation where different countries are all contributing to some portion of everybody's global basic income. If it ends up being that paying out of basic income gives you some kind of advantage, right?
But is there like a first mover advantage? You know, would it really make sense for multiple countries to be then piling on?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a first mover advantage. I guess the question is, if you're the other country and you see the United States start doing this, what limits you? So the United States, yeah, is it going to be a problem where you start paying it out, but everyone already has enough money to purchase all the global economy's productive capacity. So you start paying it out, and then that causes your currency to depreciate because everybody already has enough money in dollars, that kind of thing. So maybe it could be something like that. There's also not just the first mover advantage, but the fact that the dollar is the world's reserve currency puts us in a unique position to be able to do something like this. Another country could do it, but it wouldn't be necessarily quite as efficient or as effective because you pay out the basic income and then everybody has to kind of convert their basic income that they got into dollars and then into their local currency and that kind of thing, because you still have to kind of go through the dollar. But if Europe started doing it or England started doing it, then that might even start shifting the balance of what is the world's reserve currency. If everybody has British pounds, right, then that is a strong reason to price things in British pounds. And you could imagine that that this could be a way for another country or another currency to potentially leapfrog the United States dollar by being the first mover on something like the basic income.
I thought it was going to be hard to convince countries, but now I think we better tell them they got to get in there before the other countries beat them to it.
Oh man, it's do or die. If any countries out there are listening, if you're not about to pay out a global basic income, you're going to be left behind. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Ali.
Yeah, let's go to Matt.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly mention the Give Directly experiment in Kenya recently. So that, to my knowledge, is the biggest trial of basic income in a developing country. So in that experiment, they gave a total of $10 million in cash transfers to some rural villages in Kenya. I think it was in US dollars, but I looked it up and I wasn't sure if that was in US dollars or local currency. But regardless, $10 million, which is 15% of local GDP. And they found that it grew local GDP by 2.6 times the initial investment without causing any inflation, just because it utilized so much capacity that was just sitting idle. Additionally, they found that even households that didn't receive the payment ended up spending and saving more. Just because there was so much more wealth in the community. And so it doesn't seem to me that you need it to be the US dollar or something to incentivize, foreign investment or whatever. Obviously, if you're the US, then sure, having, 2 billion people who want to buy your products in US dollars seems pretty good. But as for the livelihoods of the recipients of the basic income, it seems like just having some sort of token to trade with in an economy that revolves around exchanging those tokens is just the key to unlocking economic output.
Yeah, for sure. When you're receiving a basic income, what you want is money that you can actually spend in your economy. So you want it to be in whatever currency everyone else around you is using. So even if we paid out a global basic income in the dollar, that doesn't necessarily mean that someone in Kenya is going to be receiving dollars into their bank account and then they have to figure out how to exchange it or something like that. Presumably, it would all be once you get to the last mile or something like that, it would be in a form that people can actually use in their local economy. Let's go to Derek.
I guess we can try to sort of imagine it goes two ways. If you imagine yourself as a currency issuer deciding to pay out a global basic income, we can think about what would let a currency issuer think that's a good idea, and then what objections would the other territories have to that, right? What motivates them to accept it? And there are objections, there are concerns. I mean, when your territory, if your population accepts a currency as its standard of value, and that's what they're using, then you de facto subject yourself to the decisions made by whoever is issuing and managing that currency. And so if you're Greece and you're using euros, and then the European Central Bank decides that you don't deserve more euros right now for whatever reason, then that's really going to affect you, right? And so how do we, there's also the question of how does the do those issues how do the decisions of the issuers of the global basic income affect spending decisions of the national governments? Do they all now sort of become local governments in the way that US state governments are? Like, do they have fiat spending power in quite the same way, or are they now subject to these kind of borrowing constraints? That's important to figure out. One way a different way to look at it is if you imagine a kind of totally politically neutral currency issuer, a bit world basic income, what could they do? I mean, they could promise that they're just going to issue the highest basic income that they can to each individual person and let the government sort of figure it out as they will. Because if you were going to say, like, we're going to maximize the basic income, and that's just what we're shooting for, and we're going to try our best, that's harder to politicize because now it's a pretty clear measure. I mean, we know that there's not as much wiggle room anymore with that. So I don't know. Those are some of the factors that I'm thinking about.
Yeah, it is an interesting point. To what extent can countries kind of spend their own currency? What are the constraints on government spending, depending on where you are in the global political hierarchy, where you are in the global currency hierarchy? So the reality is that if you look at the world monetary system, most countries kind of are in the situation where they've accepted the dollar as their reserve currency. So you use the analogy of a European country under the euro, but the reality is that most of the countries in the world are related to the dollar similarly to how the European member countries are related to the euro. Maybe it's not as tight of a restriction and it's not like regulated and that kind of thing. But if you're using the dollar as your world reserve currency, then the Fed is the central bank of the global monetary system. So it's not the IMF, it's not the Bank of International Settlements or something like that. It's the Fed. The Fed is the central bank for the entire world. And anytime the Fed decides to do something with their monetary policy, anytime the United States government decides to do something with their fiscal policy, that affects the global monetary system. And these other countries don't really have a choice. Our institutions are making these decisions based on what they feel is best for the American economy. And then everyone else just kind of has to okay, well, that's good for the American economy, but you've screwed us over, that kind of thing. And that's just kind of the way it works. And this is obviously, a lot of people would say that this is not ideal. Is it possible to move away from that? Is having a global basic income, administered by the Fed, maybe one step toward doing policy, or administered by the United States, one step toward doing policy that benefits more than just American citizens? What if we acknowledge that our institutions are responsible for the proper functioning of the global economy, and we start making policy based on that, not just based on taking care of Americans and the American economy, taking care of the global economy. And I think we do that to some extent, like the Fed, is a little bit aware of that, but it's really mostly focused on America and everyone just kind of has to go along with it. Not an ideal scenario. Let's go to Austin.
Yeah, I mean, people have sort of touched, I just want to sort of agree with that concern that you've raised about then American institutions. American institutions already have this oversized role in the global economy, and America's interests diverge from global interests sometimes. And, you've seen that with Ben Bernanke being grilled about why did you lend all this money to the Europeans and blah, 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 back in 2008. And look, the other thing is, I don't want to get all, death to America here, but American hegemony isn't just economic. It's based on military dominance and military power as well, right? And that's problematic for the world, and it's problematic for America. I mean, you see this in American political discourse increasingly, all the sort of the wars overseas and the forward bases and stuff. Americans seem to resent it, like they're doing the world this big favor at America's expense. And everyone, and the world is kind of like, yeah, okay, well, you can stop any time to a certain extent. There's a problem of what happens in a vacuum if America withdraws. But I mean, this is perhaps a very MMT view, and it's also the view in the article that the acceptance of the dollar, in the article it was about gold and how a powerful nation might pay in gold, but people are really accepting that because they believe in the power of that society, right? But the US dollar's acceptance as global currency is tied to all these other political conditions of US dominance, right? And those US hegemony is both problematic and in decline. So it seems extremely, it might be easier in the short term, but you're setting yourself up for problems down the road when America goes back to just being, a country in the world rather than de facto world government. I mean, the IMF and stuff that we mentioned before, it's worth pointing out that America has basic veto in those institutions as well. So America, right now you look at Lebanon's having a massive currency crisis because it can't get enough US dollars to back up its own pound, its lira. And it's heading for a major crisis. Nothing to do with printing money, but you won't hear any of the people who worry about inflation talking about that. But prices are skyrocketing in local currency, and they can't get any more US dollars. And the IMF, there's this complicated situation there where the IMF is worried that the local governments are corrupt and won't give fresh loans or won't give debt forgiveness. Right, so that's crashing their currency, and it's only really the U.S. government can solve their problem, right? And because the current administration is, a bit of a basket case, there's very little chance that that's going to happen, and so people in Lebanon are going to go hungry because of the U.S. domestic politics is too hot, and the international institutions in other countries can't get the attention of the U.S. administration, and also in the idea with multiple countries. Making a sort of uncoordinated, unilateral decisions about global basic income, I worry that you get into like a Nash equilibrium situation where everyone's trying to guess what everyone else is doing, and trying to sort of get ahead of the curve and who's got the advantage and when they do that with their currency, what's that going to do with ours. And I see, it's a situation that could get very complex and very political very quickly. And that could spill over into, other areas of politics, including military, military sort of muscle, military muscle becomes part of the question very quickly when you've got uncoordinated international action going on. And so that's why I really feel like you've got to have some kind of central, global plan for it. Which may require some changes to international institutions, but those are probably long overdue anyhow.
Yeah. I think you're probably right about some of that. And then the question is, how do you get everyone to cooperate and create the international institutions that are able to kind of carry this forward? And that's not an easy thing to do. Let's go to Richard.
Well, I thought of something. What if global warming suddenly gets worse in like 20 years or something like that, and there's a global societal collapse because of all the storms, and maybe all the water becomes polluted, so we have to escape into space, and water becomes like the global currency or universal currency or whatever, and because it can be used as we can breathe in O2. It can be used as rocket fuel with hydrogen and oxygen, like acetylene or whatever. And so everyone would require a certain amount of water and oxygen to live. And so they would hand out it for water, and it would be broken down with electrolysis or something. And everyone would say, we need so much water to live. And those who save their water and their oxygen or something would be able to create enough wealth to be able to have their own, dominate other countries, other people or something.
So is this kind of the opposite of a global basic income? Like you just have this scarce water and those people get to prosper and everyone else doesn't, or something like that?
But everyone would require a certain amount of water, and they would distribute water, humanitarians or whatever, distribute water to everyone. Because you would mine water on like the moon or in asteroids or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, of what does basic income look like in a world with a lot more scarcity than we have today? A lot of times we're imagining a future in which there's less scarcity, and basic income kind of going along with that. But, does basic income still make sense in a world with with more scarcity, with less stuff? And I think the answer is yes, but everyone would be poorer. It would be a lower basic income, that kind of thing. But it's an interesting thing to think about. Um, let's go to Eddie.
So to build off of what Austin said a little bit, I think it's interesting that I think central banks in the world are actually everyone's just following the leader, and they're actually a little bit confused about their options here. And if they really understood, the effects, they would not be in the bind that they think they are. And so the whole world basically has to follow along with the Fed, because they are afraid of capital large capital inflows. So if their interest rates are too low, they get in a lot of money and whatnot. A lot of money that can surge into their country, but then in a crisis can also suddenly surge out and hurt the value of the currency. So they're afraid of the currency becoming unstable in the face of the global financialization. But if they were really smart, what they should be doing is they should be actually raising their interest rates more, which would attract foreign capital into the country. But at the same time, they could, build up they could do two things to ease their currency. One thing is to sell their currency and to buy foreign currencies to build up the reserve. The other thing is to give the basic income to their own citizens. And by, sending out basic income to the citizens, they're also increasing the supply of their own money. So the entire world is top heavy. The entire world is too easy at the top with the debt and the wealthy, and too tight at the bottom with the workers and the poor. And so if you're really smart, you would tighten at the top with higher interest rates, ease at the bottom with UBI. Austin talked about Lebanon, which is going under very strong inflation, looking to trend towards hyperinflation. So if I were Lebanon, at this point, I would raise interest rates, and that would, help a little bit with strengthening of the currency. The classical reason that countries are not able to do this is that their economy is also not going very well at this time. And so classically, the idea is that if you raise interest rates, you're going to, choke off your economy, and that will be bad. But with basic income, at the same time that you're raising interest rates in Lebanon, you could also be giving out a basic income in the Lebanese currency, so that you're supporting the workers and the poor and the economy, at the same time that you're tightening, at the top, which the whole world should be doing anyways, but nobody else knows it. Nobody else is doing it. But by tightening at the top, you would actually kind of bring all of, some of that, savings, some of that excess capital that's washing all around the world into your country, to do good things, because now that your people have money to spend, investing in your country is going to be great. The other thing I want to say is that this is the startup idea of the century. If you realize that what the world needs today is currency, and if you realize that currency is basically just paper or records or cryptocurrency, it's just a piece of software, then the startup idea of the century is to build is to send this currency out, and you could do it with this sort of a Groupon 2.0, sort of a Groupon 2.0, where you're sending out currency to people as basic income, and you're selling it to producers, to businesses as, if you come onto our platform and provide things on our platform, we've got lots of people that need to buy your products, and there's a huge demand for for marketing, there's a huge demand for demand. Companies are starved of people buying their products. So that's a startup idea of the century. So if anybody knows anything about cryptocurrencies or startups, you should contact me.
Well, I'm sure you've read the Gresham white paper at this point. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And yeah, definitely check out Austin's idea too. Yeah, so I mean, I think that's an interesting point. So before we were talking about, if the United States pays out a global basic income, what if other countries respond by also paying out a global basic income? But you know what? They could also respond by paying out a national basic income just for their own citizens. And if they've got money cycling in, if they've got dollars cycling into their economy, then that might make it easier for them to pay out a domestic basic income on top of the global basic income the United States is already paying out. And at the same time, if they want to prevent inflation, that kind of thing, they could tighten their own domestic monetary policy, because there's always a kind of a flow of money coming in, which they can then recycle. So yeah, that's maybe less problematic for that country than them responding by paying out a global basic income themselves, because then you're only kind of supporting your own citizens at that point. Because obviously, even for the United States, if all you care about is American citizens, you're not going to pay out a global basic income. You're going to pay out a national basic income. So the United States would be paying out a global basic income because we recognize that we care about all the citizens of the world, and the citizens of the world are kind of depending on us, and these other countries are kind of depending on our institutions. We would have to acknowledge that and accept that, and accept maybe that, especially in the short run, we might not see the benefit directly. But obviously, if you live in a world where every country is rich and nobody anywhere is poor, then that in the long run makes Americans better off too.
It'd also be a really, it'd be a genius way to pivot around, this idea with all the countries kind of criticizing each other or America mainly, and criticizing China for trying to keep their currency down. Well, if you think that's going on, you should just say, we want to help the world, and that is why we're sending our dollars all around the world. And
right.
As a coincidental byproduct, that would actually ease your currency and help with the trade balance. And you could, if you want a trade surplus, it's easy to get one. Just send your currency out. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. So I wanted to, you kind of touched on the cryptocurrency there, and Matt brought it up earlier as well. What if we have a currency that's not managed by any particular institutions? So I think, when we think about this, I'm, kind of notoriously skeptical of cryptocurrency, but I'll tell you why. And it's that when you think about what currency is, it has to have a standard value. It has to have a standard purchasing power that comes from outside the market. So in order for the market to be efficient, it has to be able to set prices in terms of this unit that's neutral, that's immune to market forces. So you can't have a currency whose value is determined by the market, because by definition, it's something that's independent of the market. So typically what we do is we have institutions that manage the currency, the stability of the currency externally to the market. So if market forces try to push the currency in one direction, the economic policies come back and push in the opposite direction. Now, historically, we've used gold and stuff like that as currency in times and places, and other various commodities and things like that. But the thing that they all have in common is that, when you're using gold as currency, it's because the market says, hey, gold is kind of this universal thing. It's not going to be, it's still kind of somewhat immune to market forces. It's not going to be pushed around too much. Of course, gold isn't perfect. There's a reason why we don't use gold as currency anymore. There's a reason why we actually have institutions that manage the currency more actively. So if you're trying to do something with a cryptocurrency, you can't just have that be, there's no way to do it automatically inside of the market. It's just not really possible. And I'll call on you in a second, Matt, but I just wanted to bring up that, you talked about the Bitcoin being limited to a certain specific amount, which gave it scarcity. Scarcity isn't just about there being a specific amount, but it's also about the level of spending being constrained. So if you have a specific amount of Bitcoin, then that makes it scarce. But if the currency is also being managed in such a way that the flow is not going to get too big, the flow of spending is not going to get too big, that's a form of scarcity as well. So the dollar has scarcity, and anything that you would use as currency has to have scarcity. And it's a matter of keeping the flow of spending balanced with the flow of production so that you're at the right level of scarcity. The problem with Bitcoin is that you can't really, if you're just talking about kind of on-chain Bitcoin transactions, you can't really modulate the flow of spending. You could create a credit structure that sits on top of Bitcoin, so people are really trading IOUs for Bitcoin the way we used to be trading, paper gold and that kind of thing. Then you might be able to get some of that kind of modulation of the flow of money that you need to have a stable currency. But beyond that, I'm incredibly skeptical of any currency that you try to make work that doesn't have the institutions that push against any unexpected market forces. So Matt, I'll call on you now.
Yeah, I don't have too much experience with cryptocurrencies. Generally, I'm pretty skeptical. Yeah, for the record, I think Bitcoin is dumb and makes no sense, and it's just operating on like the greater fool principle. Yeah, I mean, I did read like one Medium article on a basic income advocate who was, proposing that kind of basic income. And that was a lot of new ideas, so I don't remember them all that well. I meant to review it before this, but I got like halfway through. Yeah, I do. Yeah, generally I'm skeptical of cryptocurrency, but I think in this case, I'm more in favor of it because one, it seems very difficult to establish all the infrastructure for like some existing country to provide a global basic income. And so, if you can take advantage of everyone who has like a cell phone or something, do it electronically, then that makes it a lot easier. And also I worry, as Derek pointed out, that, if it's in like the US dollar for something, then like you're bypassing like all these like smaller national governments. And, while that might be good for, the people receiving the basic income, that gives the US a lot of power over like everyone in the world, which seems worrying. We haven't always used that in the best way. So I'm skeptical of that approach. Yeah, as to whether it's possible to have some sort of unscarce cryptocurrency, I'm sure there's some reasoning in this article, but I don't remember it. I'm not sure how it would work, but I think it's worth thinking about. I think it would be a very different mode of exchange than our current monetary system. And just because it's different, I don't think that we should assume that it's impossible, but I think it would require a very different community focused conception of money than we have now. I don't have a lot of answers, but I think it's worth thinking about.
All right. Well, definitely, I encourage you to think more about it. Let's go to Austin.
Hey, I wanted to follow up with one thing about the cryptocurrency idea is that you can have both. You can have institutional control and cryptographic techniques. So, you're issuing this, you have the global institution that's doing whatever it's doing, it's issuing this currency, and it can do that so electronically and use, cryptography, which is essentially maths, as a sort of anti-counterfeiting technique, and it was a way of making sure, so people can keep, so that it can be kept track of. And on that note as well, like one of the things about Bitcoin is the scarcity is dependent basically on computing power, which is then dependent on energy. So you can actually imagine that, like when people say with gold, well, what if an asteroid lands that's made entirely of gold, the gold price is going to plummet. Or in this case, if someone, cracks fusion power in the next 10 years, you can imagine the bottom falling out of Bitcoin whenever. But that would be an obvious trigger for that to happen, is that, all of a sudden energy is way less scarce. So it drops out. regarding the Lebanon issue, thing, I wanted to come back around that. It's like, yes, the central bank could tighten rates, and also the Lebanese government could more effectively tax, right? Which is one of the big problems that it actually has, is that it's a very corrupt, ineffective government that doesn't tax the wealthy or anybody very effectively, because it's it's so it's sort of fractious, and there's all these other political problems with it. The one more thing I wanted to say is about the problem of access. People were sort of saying, well, how do we get, how do you spend this currency in the local economy? It's like, well, right now we have that problem pretty much solved already. If I have an account in US or Australian dollars, I can go to China or wherever, and it just at the ATM, when I pull the money out, it gets converted, or at the point of sale. So which also means if you've got inflation happening in that country, it sort of keeps pace, because you keep your money in the global currency, and then at the moment you spend it, it's adjusted at the exchange rates at that time. So, fourth thing, when you were talking before about the inflow of US dollars, it's just something that occurred to me is, I've heard people say before, including you, Alex, that inflation happens when there's not enough for people stuff for people to buy in the economy. Well, one thing you can buy with money is other kinds of money. And that's the sort of, if there are US dollars around, if I'm in, Lebanon or whatever, and there's actually a scarcity of stuff to buy, if I can buy US dollars or global currency with my local currency, that's going to give me some confidence in it. Despite, that's a sort of, as a stand-in for actual goods. If there's a trade embargo or whatever, and I can't buy, electronics or whatever I want to buy, I might say, well, I'm going to buy US dollars because I'm nervous about the local currency. And then the fact that I can do that makes me less nervous about the local currency. So that's various things from various points, little bookmarks I had from the conversation until now.
Yeah, I like that. Certainly, if you are in some currency that's depreciating or inflating away or something like that, and you buy dollars or dollar-denominated assets, then that's going to protect you. One issue is that if you make it really easy for people to do that, then you might end up in a situation where everybody kind of flees the domestic currency. So there's all this extra domestic currency that's out there because everyone's immediately converting to dollars. So that can actually, this behavior of protecting yourself, of individual people protecting themselves, can actually accelerate the problem in the domestic currency. Maybe that's not the end of the world. Yeah, go ahead.
I would just say, and then the way for the government to respond to that would be demand increased taxes in the local currency as well, right? Like put a sales. No. I mean, in an emergency situation, you're worried about the value of your currency you can create demand for it through tax, which, by the way, my article I also talked about.
So I don't think that's right. I think if you raise taxes, people will do the same thing. They'll hold the dollars until the moment they have to pay the tax, and then they'll convert into the domestic currency, and they'll wait as long as possible because the value of it will go down and down and down and that kind of thing. I don't think taxes are gonna protect you in that case. But it also might not be the end of the world because maybe it's okay that the currencies that people use globally kind of consolidate, and we're on more of kind of a uniform system because we live in a global economy. So if everyone just kind of de facto starts using the whatever currency the global basic income is being paid out in, if it's dollars, that's fine. If it's something else, then maybe that's better. But that might be more efficient.
Well, that would be less problematic if it's not US dollars, because then, right, you're pushing people back into this position where they're vulnerable to US decisions, and which is already an issue.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about. Let's go to Derek.
I just kind of wanted to follow up on the earlier discussion about cryptocurrency in relation to a world UBI. I think something to make clear is that I think in the current moment, cryptocurrency as a label, that happens to have sort of cornered the market on people's ideas about a digital currency, an alternative currency, a currency that's not issued by the current institutions. But really, cryptocurrency is like a specific type of technology. And as kind of Alex his bone to pick with it, and he likes to point out he doesn't really think it's really that technology is appropriate to how a currency might work. So when we sort of talk about the possibilities of a cryptocurrency, we might want to just separate that from the possibilities of alternative or new or digital currency, which they're two different things. And I actually think it is possible to imagine a tech startup, as it were, creating a digital currency and sending it out. It just might be that that particular technology may not be well suited to that. You might actually, the challenge that any new type of currency is going to solve here is going to be accepted, to be adopted, to become used, to be reliable. And you can think of cryptocurrency advocates as making the claim that this technology, the Bitcoin and blockchain, that's an answer to that. And maybe not. Maybe actually that's not so desirable. Maybe there's other factors that the currency would have to navigate through. So if you're interested in more learning about digital currencies, I really recommend the work of someone named Eliza Howitt. She put out a really well-researched paper comparing like the whole idea of doing a digital currency UBI. And the whole advantage of doing a digital currency UBI, I think, as opposed to going through the state mechanism, is that precisely that. It's probably easier to get to a world UBI that way than through the current national institutions. So yeah, anyway, I just wanted to recommend that reading.
Yeah, I think there's another distinction to be drawn as well, because state currencies are really digital currencies too. So there's a distinction to be drawn between state currencies and maybe non-state currencies, or currencies that are being managed by alternative institutions. If you have institutions that like a traditionally managed currency where you've got monetary policy and fiscal policy and all that kind of stuff, and you happen to be using cryptographic primitives in your ledger or something like that, I wouldn't call that a cryptocurrency. So Austin was saying you can have a cryptographic secured ledger or something like that and still have institutions managing it. Just in terms of semantically, my definitions, I would not call that a cryptocurrency. I just call that a regular currency that happens to be using a certain underlying technology or something like that. And that's traditionally with cryptocurrency, kind of the problem they're trying to solve is the idea that the economy needs money, but you don't necessarily want these politically motivated institutions managing it, because then you've got kind of like this power center, and you don't want to be beholden to that. So I think I guess that's all I have to say there. Let's go to Eddie.
So a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin is kind of the Austrian economist's dream currency. You have that hard limit with the 21 million total Bitcoin that can never be mined. There's no possibility of monetary policy by the currency issuer. It's completely set up to be completely laissez-faire. It's just the market participants can do whatever they want, and it's the algorithm is just set up. It's 21 million. That's all there will ever be. There is a distinction here that I think is important, which is the distinction, the two functions of currency. One is for enabling spending, and another is for enabling saving. And so I think Bitcoin, I mean, if you look at the facts, the history of it, the first rally in Bitcoin was up to $11, back in, I think it was 2011 or 2012. And people thought that was really crazy that it went from, before that it was like cents, went up to $11. People said that's crazy, and then it crashed and it came back down to $3 or $4. Now it's at $10,000. So the future is not necessarily continuation of the past, but in terms of what has happened so far, I think that Bitcoin as a vehicle for saving has been incredibly successful. And one of the things about that is that as what has been an amazing vehicle for savings for the last 10 years has been an absolute terrible vehicle for spending. So they have someone who bought a pizza with Bitcoin, the first pizza I ever bought, and Bitcoin was cents on the Bitcoin. So if they'd held on to that Bitcoin instead of buying a pizza, they basically spent like $100 million in today's currency on that pizza. It's the fact that it's appreciating, because of Gresham's law, which I'm sure Alex is very aware of. It means that this want to spend if you believe it's a currency that you'd want to save. So I think it would be very interesting to look at how to balance those two things. I think Bitcoin, again, it benefits from the current environment. And that narrative is very strong in certain circles where people are saying, the whole world is going crazy with monetary policy, going crazy with printing and increasing the money supply. And they're saying, we don't want to be in traditional currencies. We want to be in Bitcoin. So it's absorbing a great deal of savings in the world, but it's not successful at enabling spending. So Bitcoiners will say, well, that'll come much later, and that's possible. That's a possibility. But I think it would be very interesting to tie the whole thing to basic income and try to get a currency that will benefit by absorbing, all that excess savings in the world, and also benefit by enabling people to spend, which is also sorely needed in the world.
Yeah, I like to say that currency is the thing you spend, not the thing you save. If you want to save money, then what you're really saving is you're buying assets, or you're investing in things that you expect to provide a positive return. So Bitcoin can be one of those things, if you like living dangerously. But there are plenty of other investment instruments. But currency is special, especially the currency unit, in that it's the economy's standard pricing unit. So sure, if you hold on to currency tokens, on the money tokens, that is a store of value, but it's not the optimal store of value. You'll save in some other form. Currency is really it's the standard that you set prices in, and it's the token that you spend to be able to pay those prices. That's the main thing. And so I like to say that cryptocurrency is not currency, because if you're expecting something to go up in value over time, then it's not money. What we're talking about isn't money; it's some other kind of asset. And that's true of Bitcoin, and it's true of any asset that's expected to increase in value. And if you don't have institutions that are managing the stability of the currency, then the market isn't going to choose to use that as its standard pricing unit, that kind of thing. And I also want to point out that Gresham's law does not apply to Bitcoin. So Gresham's law, for people who are not familiar, it's the reason why when the United States switched from silver quarters to the quarters we have now that are made of copper and nickel, if you went to the store and you had some silver quarters in your pocket and you had some of the new quarters, you'd spend the new quarters. So that's Gresham's law. You spend the overvalued currency and you hold on to the undervalued currency, the silver. So then the bad money ends up being the money that people actually use in circulation. In order for Gresham's law to hold, you need to have certain contexts in which the two currencies are accepted at equal value. So by law, a quarter is 25 cents when you go to the merchant, right? So in this context, they're accepted at equal value, but then there also have to be other contexts where they're not accepted at equal value. It's definitely worth more to have a quarter's worth of gold, or a quarter that's made of gold, not gold, but silver, a quarter that's made of silver versus a quarter that's made of copper and nickel. You can melt down that silver and sell it for much more than a quarter. So that's when Gresham's law applies. And Bitcoin, there's no regulation that says Bitcoin has to be accepted on par with something else in some context or something like that. So Gresham's law does not apply to Bitcoin. Let's go to Bethany.
I just had a very small point that's not that important, but we were talking about energy use and the value of Bitcoin, and I wanted to ask you, Alex, to clarify how that worked. Because I kind of thought the energy you had to use scaled up to the kind of energy available, which I think was a little bit different. This is, again, maybe not that important, but to what Austin was talking about if you had more energy. I think I've heard, my thought is, or my understanding is, one of the limitations is actually that the more energy you have available, the more energy you have to use to mine it or to get it. And so it kind of just like burns up a lot of energy that way.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So if we crack, fusion technology and everybody's still using Bitcoin, it's not going to crash the price of Bitcoin. It's going to kind of obviate the fusion innovation, because all of the energy is going to go to mining Bitcoin now. That's kind of how it ends up shaking out. The amount of energy usage goes up to match the value of the Bitcoin. So if energy, you would think it would get really cheap with fusion technology, well, okay, now you just have to use even more energy to mine the same amount of Bitcoin. That's kind of how it works. But as Austin was saying, Bitcoin could crash at any time for any of us as well.
Right.
Yeah.
But anyway, so yeah, I just thought that was,
Yeah.
I don't know why, I didn't have to bring that up, I guess. But it's just,
No, that's fine. It's an interesting point. And it's also questionable whether you could even have blockchain technology that doesn't have this feature to it, where it just sucks up all the energy. So let's go to Austin.
Okay, well, I wasn't going to say this, but I guess since it was just brought up, my understanding of Bitcoin is that each unit requires more energy than the last unit to be mined. That's okay. So my understanding was that because you've got to process every other block on the chain beforehand, there's a steady increase of the energy required, whereas it would be a non-linear chain, rather, a completely discontinuous change if you had a new energy supply. So clearly I don't understand blockchain or Bitcoin as well as I thought I did, but anyhow. But what I was saying before about currency, institutional currency, what my actual terminology was that beg your pardon, was that it would be cryptographically minted, or they would use cryptographic techniques, not that it would actually be a cryptocurrency. So like cryptography in terms of like code breaking and stuff like that precedes cryptocurrency and was already being used, in printing pounds and paper currencies, and the fact that they have serial numbers, which are determined by, extremely complicated maths. So we already kind of do, maybe not cryptographically, but cryptography. I don't know. Anyhow, there's already a cryptographic element to state produced money. And I'm saying you could have that in the digital space and without necessarily being a cryptocurrency, right? So I basically agree with that distinction.
Yeah, I think your intuition is right that we basically have secure money now. We have secure digital money now too. All of the kind of dollars that we use, we have reliable database technology, and we keep track of payments, and it's not often that you hear about money just kind of evaporating from the system because it wasn't programmed reliably or something like that. And that's because people put, they really care about getting this stuff right. If you're a bank, you really need to get this stuff right, both due to regulations and reputation and all of that. So that's important. So back to global basic income. I mean, I think it's a tough nut to crack, and I think everyone's intuitions here is that you do have to have global institutions that manage the global currency and pay out the global basic income. So there's always going to be some kind of hierarchical structure, and someone's going to be at the top of the hierarchy. Because if it's not the United States and you're creating a new kind of global level institution, you're putting someone else on the top of the hierarchy. And then a question we can ask is, what kinds of problems emerge just from that structure? The fact that there is someone at the top of the hierarchy or some institution kind of in charge of managing this stuff. And maybe there's some difficulties with that, but it also might be the case that if the policy that they're focused on is very simple, something like a basic income, that gets harder to mess up. It's very straightforward. You're not like making judgment calls about who deserves what and that kind of thing. So it might be immune to, or it might be more resistant to errors. It might be more resistant to corruption and that kind of stuff. If you're kind of like, if you are kind of at the top of that hierarchy, but your scope is very simple and well defined. Go ahead, Austin.
Yeah, well, I just want to add that I think those global institutions are more established and stronger than people sometimes seem to think. I mean, the idea to me that that a nation is going to leave the United Nations or you leave the IMF or that these institutions are going to break down seems to me quite unlikely. It seems like people are quite already, there's a degree of commitment to these, which has sort of settled into people's sort of expectations, right? And it's not that dissimilar to the United States, rather. You know, immediately after the War of Independence, didn't have a federal army, was dominated by economically powerful states like Virginia, right, or whatever, whoever was the dominant powers at the time, right? And the idea of the central government was viewed with skepticism, both the way that people talk about a new world order now, and also in the sense that, oh well, it's a paper tiger, it's really weak. Actually, all the powers with the states, and particularly a few powerful states. But there was a progression underway that was very politically difficult to reverse, because being in a bigger block is better than being in a smaller block for, all those reasons. And, when the IMF dropped, when it increased the number of SDRs by 10-fold a few years ago, right? And people went along with it. People said, okay, we accept this because we're all part of this big global political community. And I think that sense is quite strong. And in fact, there was a study about this that found most people believe in global institutions, but they don't believe that other people believe in it, right? So they believe that I believe in global institutions, but I'm more inclined to be towards global institutions than other people in my country or other people in other countries. So it's one of these things where people talk about a virtual belief, which is something that everybody pretends to believe, even though they don't. This is like a reverse virtual belief, like a virtual disbelief. Everyone imagines that there's no faith in the global system and that they're the only one, but actually it's kind of ready to go.
Oops, I double clicked on the microphone button. Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point. And I guess we can ask, to what extent is it ready to go? And I think a lot of people would say that the IMF and a lot of these global monetary institutions do have an important role, but they are very much, like you said, the IMF is constrained by the United States veto power, and all of these institutions are kind of constrained by their members. Generally speaking, they kind of have to. All of the members kind of have to agree in order to move something forward. So if you're going to try to make this happen through one of these institutions, it feels like you have to get more countries working together than just doing it unilaterally, having one country do it unilaterally. So that might end up being harder to do, even if those institutions are kind of strong on the face of it. So yeah, go ahead.
In my essay, which I shared in the chat, I do talk about how countries could come together in what I call a currency club and do it without a global institution. So you get, you set up some kind of multilateral institution, and here you can't use SDRs because the IMF's not necessarily on board. So what you do then is you agree that everybody's going to pay some tax in this currency back to the central organization that you've created. And I say that you could just set that as a percentage of what your citizens get. So your citizens get however much, and then the government has to pay back 20% of that each year to this central organization. And then you can have countries sort of join as they like. And all you really, if you imagine the citizens and the government as one unit, which they should be, right? Then all you're saying is, I'm going to give you $1 of this new currency, and you're going to give me back 20 cents. Right, so it seems like an obvious thing to join, but as long as there's enough demand that people are confident in the currency, then you're putting value into the nations that participate, and you adjust that rate. You adjust the outgoing rate and the amount that you're charging back in tax, like as instead of a central bank, that becomes a monetary lever that you use to manage this new currency, which is not as good, but it can work without universal involvement at the start.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. We had a discussion here a while ago on private cities, where the city is providing a service to its citizens, and then the citizens, pay the tax as the fee. And you could imagine that if you have this global basic income institution, that is maybe something that is provided to any country who wants to participate, and then you have kind of like money flowing up through the countries, and then back down from the top, from the centralized institution, which is kind of a little bit about what we were talking about in the private cities example, where you'd have the government pay all the citizens the basic income, and then the citizens can decide, kind of what city they want to live in, that kind of thing. There's interesting structures about, does the money flow down through the individual units or the individual levels of government, or does it flow directly to the citizens from the top and then back up through the individual levels of government? So certainly a lot more discussion that we could have on that. But we are getting toward the end, so I want to get people's final thoughts. We'll go around. We'll go Derek, Bethany, and then Eddie.
There's something I want to think more about. I think that there are the challenges on the international level seem to me mostly to be amplified politically. I think it's much easier for me to imagine basically getting started nationally in a political sense. And my instinct is that if we're talking about global, there's a big advantage there to looking at a independently run new currency by a non-government entity, because it sort of bypasses that problem. You just start handing it out, and if it's accepted as currency, then the governments really are in the position of having to decide how to react to it. Yeah, that's all for now.
Okay, great. Let's go Bethany, Eddie, and then Elizabeth.
Yeah, so great discussion, lots of interesting thoughts. One thing I was thinking about towards the end is the politics of basic income and how difficult it is to get people to buy into the idea and get past the idea that everyone should work for a living. So in terms of global basic income, I was just speculating about what it could look like if the acceptance of basic income kind of went in reverse, in terms of, well, not reverse, but went from poorer countries to wealthier countries. And what I mean by that is, like, maybe we're more willing to accept something like Give Directly. Like, we kind of understand people in certain countries can't just like start working really hard and activate the economy on their own. So we're more willing to think about that as something that makes sense. And then if those countries were to implement it, and then we saw some of the macroeconomic effects there and how beneficial it was, could that kind of make it more palatable in first world countries? So just different than having one global basic income, but in terms of global effects of watching what happens in one country, it would be interesting if it actually went in that direction. I tend to think of it as starting in a wealthy country like the US, but the political acceptance of it might be easier in a poorer country in some ways, in terms of people's mentality around work and working for a living and things like that. Anyway, just another thought.
Yes, an interesting point. Let's go to Eddie, Elizabeth, and then Matt.
So Austin and Alex were talking about taxation and currency value, and I totally agree with Alex that taxation does not drive demand for the currency for exactly the reason that he said. But I think it's interesting to note that what Austin brought up, the ineffectiveness of the government at taxing, I think, is still related to the inflation or hyperinflation. Because if you think about it, the currency issue is a little bit like a bank.
You there, Eddie?
But
Eddie, you blipped out for a moment there. Can you repeat the last thing you said?
To worry about the government, it has no tax revenues, and it has all these debts, so it's going to have to print currency. Then that will affect the value of the currency. Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think we should definitely start a currency because the world needs it.
Okay. Sounds like a good
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah,
Let's
I'll
go.
have to ask Alex later about more about the Project Gresham, the currency, because I've heard it mentioned, but I've never heard the kind of the recent status of the project.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk about it. Let's go to Elizabeth, Matt, and then Richard.
Yeah, I really appreciate the interesting discussion about sort of implementation of like whether it be an independent agency or like a specific country in charge, like a lot of factors I hadn't sort of thought about for the actual like high level implementation. I still think, I mean, it's fine that we didn't talk about it, but definitely I'm like, yep, still left with the question I had like at the beginning of sort of how do you figure out the levels of that? And, and like the point that you made, Alex, about like, okay, yeah, services you can't just purchase off of Amazon that like, if yeah, people could order things from like the global economy, but you can't get someone to like educate your children or something like that sort of, I mean, I guess we're trying to pretend like we can do that online, but yeah, like people can't cut your hair virtually. And so the sort of delivery of services, like how do you build up infrastructure for that? And the sort of more basic question of how do you figure out leveling of like, yeah, if you give people, $30 a month, like that's going to go really far in Kenya and much less far in Canada. And so are you like, how do you figure out what the level is? And are you doing it at the global level or at more block levels, whether that's regional, national, whatever?
Yeah, I'm sorry we didn't get into that more. My sense is that you would just want to have the same level for everyone, and then that creates the conditions for the economy to kind of equalize among different people as well, because everybody has the same income. Now, if there are places that are really cheap, but you get the same income no matter where you live, maybe that's an incentive to move to cheaper places. It's an incentive to maybe develop more services in cheaper places, and then that kind of equalizes things. Is not perfectly or anything. If you try to adjust the amount of the basic income based on location, then you create some weird incentives. Like, are you paying people to move to a certain place? That kind of thing. So my intuition is that by default, you'd want to give everyone the same amount of money, even though it stretches a lot further in Mexico and India than it does in the United States. And then you'd see the effects of that, and that would generally be positive effects. So let's go to Matt, Richard, and then Steve.
Yeah, so I think we're all generally in agreement that a global basic income or a variety of basic incomes that cover everyone is a good idea. It's just not entirely clear what's the best way to get there. It seems like maybe the simplest, with a mountain of salt, I would say, way to get there right now is either like the IMF or like one country like the United States saying we're going to give everyone in the world $1 a day, which is probably an improvement. But on the other hand, you've got the U.S. and those big countries, flexing their economic might, which potentially has unfortunate consequences for less economically powerful countries. And I think we see these dynamics already today. So that might just entrench that, so I hesitate there. On the other hand, if the US does a national one, limiting poverty in the US is great, but the US still benefits quite a lot from poverty-induced labor throughout the rest of the world. And so, we do have a responsibility to, a moral obligation to ensure that, no one is working just to escape poverty. So, how you balance that responsibility with that inevitably turning into a tool of like US economic might, I'm not really sure about. So I guess one other option is like every country individually does their own national basic income, which seems pretty good until, you know, some country screws up their currency and then all those basic income recipients are holding worthless tokens. So then the final possibility is some sort of new currency that's somehow not controlled by powerful economic actors, which certainly has the most questions about it. So just a lot of upsides and downsides to weigh. Yeah, but certainly worth considering. And if we can make it work, that'd certainly do a lot of good.
Okay, good stuff. Let's go to Richard, Steve, and then Austin.
Well, to go against what Elizabeth said, I can see that someone like teleoperating a barber robot to cut hair and from like some third world country or something, because right now, just a few years ago, the Da Vinci robot was controlled by someone all the way across the Atlantic, a doctor, performing surgery on someone in the US. So there's no reason to think that's not possible. And well, to go for more of a global basic income sort of thing, well, political economic blocks from like Double Gundam with the American Union thing, and that those either accepting the strain of some sort of global apocalypse or whatever, or they're cracking under it, and they're capable, they can join together in some like world government and distribute a basic income that way, or the whole thing just collapses and everyone there's all the water's polluted with salt and things, and so they have to flee and they have to well accept water as their currency.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point you bring up about potentially more goods becoming tradable goods, especially, you know, certain services that are going to be able to move online, that kind of thing. And then, you know, of course, there's debate to be had about how far we can go with that, at least presently, or how far we'll ever be able to go with that, depending on you know, what our various constraints are. I think there's always going to be such a thing as a local good that can't really be traded, but it might not be necessarily exactly the same things we see today. So let's go to Steve and then Austin.
I'll just agree with Elizabeth. I like the idea that there's the United Nations or some globe-wide body, and they just say everybody's going to have, say, $100 a month basic income. For a lot of the world, that'll be a whole lot, but for a whole lot of the world, it won't be even worth distributing. But that doesn't matter any more than it matters in an all-American basic income. A lot of people care, and some people don't care. So I think I can imagine it being just that simple. It's some low amount, $50 or $100 a month, and that's it. And then the rest is details.
Okay, let's go to Austin.
Yeah, I think I agree basically with what Steve was just saying, that you start out as, you know, at some level that matters to the people who need it most by some, you know, global institution. And the group I cite in my article is the G20. So you've already got, like, you know, the G20 and the G7 and these global groups that meet, and, you know, they already have their central bankers and treasurers or finance ministers or whatever all come together and discuss how are we going to organize, you know, a coordinated response to issues in the global economy. And I think, you know, as I said before, the asteroid is here in the terms of deflationary pressure and, you know, a collapse in global demand after during and after the pandemic. We're going to have a lot of trouble. At the moment, national governments have been able to step in and prop that up, but the governments that will most need to will also be the least able to. So poorer countries whose currencies are the least, you know, their value is the least secure, are the ones that are going to have to face the greatest sort of social and economic crisis, so, which will then, there'll be contagion and contamination of first world economies. So, I mean, like, I always start from, you got to think, what's the ideal situation? What's the ideal response? And then negotiate down to something realistic. But I don't think we necessarily have to negotiate down that far. It's a crisis is when change happens. And, whether we need, and as talking about a global government, a government comes into being in phases. It doesn't come into being all at once, as a general rule. And one of the roles a government plays is of a currency issuer, right? And so perhaps the next step that the global state or global government needs to take is to, step into the role of currency issuer and allow America to sort of step back and the end of American monetary hegemony may be a good thing for America too, which would be a whole other discussion. But yeah, this has been maybe my favorite Boston Basic Income talk so far. So thanks, everyone.
All right, great. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I think one kind of question I can leave you guys with is related to the concept of an optimal currency area. So when does it make sense to kind of unite a particular economy or economic zone under a single currency? So obviously with the European Union, you had all these European countries with different currencies, and then there was an effort put in place to bring them all together under the euro, and they kind of had mixed results. So some people argue, hey, you're kind of inflicting or imposing this single currency on an area that's maybe not an optimal currency area. So what does it take to be an optimal currency area? And if you're not an optimal currency area, does it still make sense to have a single basic income for that area? And can imposing a single currency to what extent can imposing a single currency on the entire world or something like that help it move toward being an optimal currency area? So this is kind of related to my response to Elizabeth. Well, if you just give everyone the same basic income, then things will kind of move to be more efficient. But is that really true? I mean, my intuition is yes, but then there are lots of different factors that kind of it can interfere with that. Not to mention national borders, trade restrictions, all of that kind of stuff. So there's lots of interesting things to think about with global basic income. My intuition is still that it's a good thing and it's a good idea to give everyone in the world the same basic income and try to iron out the details and complexities, after that or before that too. But I want the basic income soon. So this is a great discussion, you guys. And next week we're talking about utopianism. So to what extent and under what contexts does it make sense to strive toward an ideal that people might think is unrealistic? And basic income is often promoted as a utopian idea, and it's often derided as a utopian idea. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing for how we talk about basic income? So that's what next week is about. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Alex.